Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. In this video we're going to be looking at two old-school role-playing games, Arcanum and Vampire Bloodlines. Both games were released by Troika Games, a now-defunct developer founded by people who worked on the original Fallout. Now, both Arcanum and Bloodlines have incredible cult followings, but outside of that, they're pretty much forgotten titles. Why didn't they sell very well to begin with? Why, if people continually praise them for their creativity and ingenuity, is there not a more stronger, lasting impression of them? We're going to be taking a look, starting with Arcanum. Arcanum began as a tremendous ambition by three titans of early computer role-playing design. Tim Cain, Leonard Boyarsky, and Jason Anderson, the three men principally behind the original Fallout. Following Fallout's release, they felt like Interplay's executive branch was making questionable decisions with the company, and struck out on their own to create a traditional 2D isometric role-playing game the way they always wanted, with total creative control. After doing preliminary work between just the three of them, now-defunct publisher Sierra Entertainment began working with them and funded the project, expanding the team to 12. But while the ambition and creativity driving Arcanum is undeniable, there's only so much that a 12-man team with a limited budget can accomplish. Arcanum, as played today in 2013, is a fascinating piece of video game history for that essential conflict. It's arguably one of the last great 2D isometrics, but it was dated and broken even on its release in 2001. What Arcanum is as a creative accomplishment and what Arcanum is as an entertainment product are wildly different creatures, factors that made it a pretty minimal success when it came out, selling around 235,000 copies, but make it an enduringly remarkable example of the special challenges video games as a creative medium face. Arcanum, as Troika's first game, was a culmination of all its founders' practical knowledge of traditional design. For many of those design features, this would be their last gasp, a final stand for old-school role-playing that lays plain the strengths and weaknesses of a mostly forgotten style of gaming. So what is Arcanum? Well, it's a beautiful variation on traditional fantasy. It takes the standard fantasy setting, elves, orcs, dwarves, castles, kingdoms, swords, sorcery, and then lets humans have their industrial revolution. With the steam engine, humans have conquered much of the world, and the ways of magic, which are fundamentally incompatible with technology, are disappearing from the world. The Age of Legends, which people in Arcanum call the time of the world's history that would have resembled other more cliché fantasy settings, is long gone. Mages live in ghettos, shut out by technological economy. Orcs labor in Dickensian factories as second-class citizens. Elves and dwarves have withdrawn into their ancient forests and mines, now threatened by logging, poaching, coal speculation, and other human interests. Meanwhile, conflicts and events set in motion thousands of years ago in the time of legends are just now reaching their conclusion, and the world neither remembers nor cares. But it should, because shit is about to get quite serious. It's 1888, and you are the only surviving passenger of a horrific blimp crash. The blimp having been shot down by two heavier-than-air flying craft, an obvious impossibility. A gnome, dying from injuries sustained in the crash, gives you a ring and a request. Find the boy. That's all the information you begin with, and what follows is an incredibly lengthy odyssey to discover the truth behind the attack, the gnome, and the ring. Along the way, you'll do what old-school RPG design is rightfully best known for, deciding the outcome of an impossibly huge variety of personal, social, political, and moral conflicts across an exuberantly creative world. The creativity of the world is Arcanum's greatest strength, undeniably. It's one of the most deeply steampunk games ever released, investing considerably more effort and thought into the aesthetic than most modern games, BioShock Infinite included. The questions the world of Arcanum faces, by moving traditional fantasy all the way to 1888, end up mirroring many questions that the player has to grapple with in the real world. What are the true costs of progress? Should mysticism disappear, or does it serve a purpose? What does the distant past matter if almost everything you see was created within the past few hundred years? Arcanum is truly remarkable for how it blends the player's knowledge and assumptions about both modern civilization and the standard fantasy setting in ways that are consistently fascinating and delightful, and its willingness to be clever and playful with its cliches is a big part of its overall charm. A major commitment to a kind of intellectual plausibility and general realness is another part. Arcanum, more than any other role-playing game I've played, modern or otherwise, considers how economic and political factors interact with cultural values to create societies. Early in the game, you visit Durnholm, the capital of the Kingdom of Cumbria. You hear the story of its dragon knights, the chivalrous old guard who wielded magic weapons and beautiful ornate armor, and how they were gunned down to the last man by volunteers with rifles from the technologically progressive nation of Tarant to the north. A familiar story, but I don't think you can really fault Troika for wanting to throw in a little of the charge of the Light Brigade. It's a well-placed, apt historical reference, which Arcanum is full of. But that happened years ago, as far as Arcanum is concerned, and the Durnholm you see is a Durnholm that's had to live with the consequences of its increasing irrelevance in the modern world for decades. It's dirt poor, politically misguided, clinging to tradition as unemployment peaks. There's still a king and queen and castle of Cumbria. That's not what the people want. They want jobs. Now that's the kind of world building you almost never see, not just opportunistically letting the player witness the big moments of a place's history, but assuming that the player is interested in how these key moments would truly play out in the long run, and that the player would want a complex answer to those complex questions. Like Fallout, Arcanum has ending slides, giving epilogues to many of the regions you pass through and alter on your path to the truth. But they're considerably more complicated slides than Fallout's. Many town outcomes consider 3 to 5 different factors in deciding your epilogue slide, including how you dealt with separate issues in other regions. It's a perfect way to cap off Arcanum, since through the bulk of the game you'll be continually interacting with Arcanum in these major, ethically murky affairs of state. One day, for example, while in Tarant, a newspaper headline talks about an orcs workers' strike at a factory led by a fellow named Don Throg. Now, if you ignore it, the police will storm the picket line and kill all the striking workers, including Throg. But if you involve yourself, you might not only save Throg, but encourage him to pursue more conventional political power. At the time, it seems like a pretty fun, quick side quest. But it turns out in the epilogue that Don Throg alters Tarant's entire political destiny, depending on whether he lives or dies, affecting not only most of Tarant's ending slides, but some of the neighboring kingdom of Caledon's as well. In contemporary RPGs, in attempting to appeal to a very broad player base, games tend to give very strong, obvious clues to how your decisions will play out, and for a very understandable reason. To a lot of players, it's frustrating for the game to produce results counter to how they anticipated it being. If you've only got a limited amount of time or patience for games, you might only play through them once, and if you look at achievement statistics for Steam or for Xbox Live, you'll find that most people don't even finish a game at all. Folks like this, casual gamers, constitute a major part of the gaming market. If you make a product that doesn't accommodate their tastes, at least to some extent, you're not going to be making as much money as you could, flat out. Back in 2001, though, gaming hadn't quite gone mainstream yet, and its player base was primarily made up of real gaming enthusiasts, and the RPG market particularly demanded complicated, multifaceted writing. Part of that is the limitations of technology. Poor graphics are less deeply felt when interesting, heavily descriptive writing fills in the gaps, a kind of bondo of the imagination. Arcanum is a very literary game in a lot of ways, and its verbosity not only serves as a means of propelling the game forward, but the script is the biggest part of how the world of Arcanum is constructed in the player's mind. It even makes sense within the setting. Arcanum's 1888 is intended to be a rough equivalent of our own, plus all those fantasy elements. 1888 was a time where communication was pretty much either in person or in print, and in either case there were a lot of cultural advantages to being eloquent. So when Arcanum's characters begin spinning long, boldly worded tales of adventure or digress into lengthy polemics on some matter of historical interest, it seems pretty reasonable that they would do so. The politeness and formality of the era lends its own charm to the writing as well. Not only do characters in Arcanum have to contend with the threat of demons, zombies, ancient magic, and pirates, they must also contend with the most nefarious danger of all, impropriety. That an RPG whose principal focus is grand adventure can be, at times, a really goddamn funny comedy of manners is a tremendous credit to Troika, and it shows a rare willingness to give the subtle human details of a game just as much attention as the back-of-the-box features. Arcanum's characters, both your companions and the general population of NPCs, are so well written, and the expectation that they would be well written was so great at the time of its release, that Arcanum's NPCs are, in fact, a back-of-the-box feature. Some of the game's companion quests are staggering in their length and ultimate ramifications, and stand as being easily as competent as anything released since. A chosen few of those companions are especially complicated, like Virgil, who you meet immediately following the opening videos, or Magnus, a dwarf without a clan. Magnus is particularly well written, since he goes so far out of his way to act like he belongs in dwarven society, to pass for having a clan. By having him be so concerned with embodying dwarven heritage, you learn a lot about dwarves before you ever meet them in the game. Other companions are more throwaway, just there to functionally round out your party. Even the companions who do have complex personal stories are actually silent on those subjects for huge swaths of the game, though, and finishing their plotlines sometimes requires very vague leaps of logic on the player's part to figure out. For the bulk of the game, companions are severely underutilized, and the player's experiences with the world are mostly as an individual, even if followed by a whole entourage of followers. This is pretty weak, especially compared to, say, Baldur's Gate 2, a peer of Arcanum's from a little before its release. But the characters leave strong first impressions, and more often than not, stronger last impressions. The quality of writing for the major NPCs, and the thought put into how the player might respond, are also way above industry average. The major movers and shakers of Arcanum's plot are very strongly characterized, have arguments for why they feel as they do on the issues of the plot, and often make very convincing counter-arguments to some of the player's inclinations and assumptions. This is especially apparent at the game's climax, which switches villains on you at the very last second, and then drops an incredibly heavy philosophical hammer right on the player's head. It's hard to do climactic villain exposition without it being cheesy, it's just such an impossible cliché. But Arcanum succeeds beyond expectations. As a player, I had spent nearly 40 hours striving to reach this confrontation and save Arcanum. And then in about 2.5 minutes, the game damn near talked me out of it. If that isn't proof of clever writing, I haven't got proof of it. These big deal characters also feature some pretty competent voice acting, although the majority of NPCs in Arcanum are not voiced. For a game like Arcanum, this is a plus. The same period flourishes that make the dialogue so charmingly 1800s could become pretty tiresome hearing it out loud constantly. Just reading it on the screen, it holds its luster longer. In terms of the grand thread of plot that the player follows through the bulk of the game, it'll be familiar to those who have played games like the first two Fallouts. Oddly, though, Arcanum's pacing is more similar to Fallout 2's than Fallout's. Odd, because the men behind Troika left Interplay after Fallout 1 to work on Arcanum instead of Fallout 2. But both games feature main plots with tenuous, connect-the-dots investigation sending you from one end of the map to the other, to the other, to the other, while meanwhile tempting your attention with a genuinely massive amount of side-questing and regional concerns. And you're as free as you are in Fallout 2 to pursue those concerns. There's no time limit and no reminder to steer your attention back on course. It isn't until the very last quarter of the game that all the pieces begin to fall into place and you understand what's been going on this whole time. But what's really neat about Arcanum is how long a time this whole time constitutes. Much of Arcanum's modern history has been shaped by the ultimately very personal and preventable tragedy that served as a catalyst for the events that sweep up the player, and that tragedy is thousands of years old. When the player is finally given enough information to see the big picture includes not only the main plot, but many of the side quests, incidental dungeons, and seemingly dead-ended threads of speculation the players encountered across the entire globe. It's really brilliant storytelling, done in a way that can really only be presented in the form of a game. The player's free will, the feeling of having participated in these events firsthand and shaped the outcome, is what makes Arcanum so memorable and heartfelt. It's easily one of the very greatest expressions of the unique creative construction of old-school computer role-playing games, and one of the very last. So if Arcanum is so wonderful a game, why is it so forgotten today? The answer lies in its technical construction. When you think of how modern RPGs are designed, the first thing you think of is reduced complexity. Character sheets are smaller, skills and abilities are slimmed down, requiring the player to perform arithmetic is no longer in vogue, leveling is frequently automated to some extent. Think Skyrim. What sparked this trend? Part of it is accessibility for larger audiences, the mainstreaming I mentioned earlier, but what makes that accessible is that it's rooted in how players are actually, by and large, interacting with the game. And mostly, that's haphazardly and impulsively. Modern games go out of their way to accommodate haphazard playstyles. Games like Arcanum are rooted in something entirely different. Indeed, the characters and statistics system developed for Arcanum isn't really rooted in electronic media at all. Arcanum's character and stat system is a system developed by tabletop D&D style gamers for tabletop D&D style gamers. Here's the fundamental problem with that. Your character in a tabletop game can do literally anything. Of course, you're guided by what you've chosen on your character sheet, but everyone in the room is just working from their imaginations and from dice rolls, and if you can make it work with those two things, you can make it work. Electronic role-playing can never be like that, because the game hasn't got an imagination. It's limited by not only the developer's imagination, but also the developer's budget. Anything beyond that scope simply won't be possible. So Arcanum has this immensely complicated and frankly not very elegant character system that lets you be pretty much any kind of character you want, with powers and abilities you can imagine using in dozens of situations. And when they were coming up with this system, they must have indeed imagined dozens of different situations for the player to solve with these myriad abilities. But dozens of applications for every skill didn't make it into the final game. For some skills, you might only have 3 or 4 opportunities to really see it play out like you imagined it working, sometimes less, occasionally more. And some skills are outrageously better and more useful than others. This is complicated by the fact that Arcanum's combat system is both awkward and unforgiving. And while you're able to talk your way past and around many interesting situations, this is no plain scrape. You're going to have to fight for your right to parley. Wizards are particularly disadvantaged, partly as a matter of the social reality of Arcanum for wizards, but also because they're not that great until way, way later in the game. Wizards have a whole city pretty much just for them, but you won't reach it until about 85% of the game is behind you. Technologists have some branches of study that are almost entirely useless. The only character build that's truly versatile is a sword and shield warrior with leanings towards science or magic. For a game that's dedicated to extremes in balance, there's not a lot of balance, which frustrates, especially because Arcanum as a role-playing experience is so goddamn good. The game itself gets in the player's way much more than it draws the player in. The thing is, Arcanum the game isn't even designed to be a computer game exactly. Arcanum the game is an automated dungeon master. The character and stats system, the dialogue, the branching choices, in a tabletop setting you could just write it down, sit everyone at the table, and have at. Arcanum is a solution to the problem of trying to play that sort of game by yourself with no one to react to your imaginative choices, attempting to illustrate from the eye-in-the-sky isometric perspective what a dungeon master would have described, articulating the characters a dungeon master would have spoken for, providing multiple solutions to preserve the feeling of self-determination. This game is actually extremely remarkable, especially for the era, at how many different solutions it gives the player, but sometimes that's a pretty unequal choice. For example, about 2/3 of the way through, the player must charter a ship to the island of Thanatos. No sane captain will take you, and the one insane one you know has lost his boat. Now you can buy a boat for a ridiculously high 50,000 gold, but barter specialists can wheedle it down to 35,000. If the player has invested completely in gambling skills, they can win the boat back in a winner-takes-all cards game with the boat's new owner, or they can complete a bargain with Stringy Pete, the cursed ghost of a notorious pirate captain from a couple hundred years back. Any character can get a boat from Stringy Pete. Gambling specialists can get the boat immediately for free, but only if they've spent tons of character points and a lot of game time tracking down the skill master and learning their secrets. If you've done that, this is your character's big moment as a gambler, and that's cool, but it's your only one. Was it worth that investment, to skip what's actually a very fun quest? The complexity of the system behind Arcanum seems like a good idea, and in a tabletop setting it would be a good idea, but it's a bad idea for an electronic RPG, because players' intentions and point investments yield wildly inconsistent results when you run up against the inherent limitations of having an automated dungeon master instead of a live one. But it's a harsh choice when designing the game in a lot of ways. If you shave off uncommon solutions, you withhold the feeling of accomplishment and cleverness that so many gamers look to these sorts of experiences to provide. But if you cram in too much choice with too little consistency, it becomes a mess of missed opportunities and nagging doubts for the player. Probably not severely enough to make them not want to play, but enough to color the game in duller tones. And speaking of dull tones, surely it hasn't escaped your attention that this game looks incredibly dated. That was as true in 2001 as it is now. Arcanum has a real visual awkwardness to it that really detracts from the experience, mostly. There are some moments when Arcanum really impresses, and some parts of its visual design are truly beautiful and memorable, but they're few and far between. Mostly, Arcanum is dominated by a frustrating, washed-out sameness. This weakness is a function of the limitations of technology at the time. A 3D Arcanum in 2001 would have looked even worse by a mile. The smallness of the development team, and a reliance on descriptive storytelling to smooth over the visual reality of the game. But even as a 2D game, Arcanum's visual presentation is poor. Arcanum also features occasional CG cutscenes that are equally inconsistent. Some are actually pretty stunning, others are pretty laughable. It's this side of Arcanum, the technical side, that principally condemned it to be forgotten. But you should also consider that it missed its market window from a business perspective. Games have looked really good for so many years that it's easy to forget how powerful the demand for better graphics and new experiences was back in the early 2000s. Look at it as a marketer would. Arcanum was a backward-thinking, dull-looking relic on the day of its release, resplendent in what it was trying to accomplish, but a very niche interest game any way you slice it. And steampunk would take another couple years to mainstream along with video games in general, so interest in steampunk wasn't the sales draw it could have been. Now, consider if you released a product like Arcanum for tablets in today's market. You have a popular familiarity with the game's themes that's way larger than it was in 2001, a demonstrable demand for small-team, low-graphics games for tablet and mobile platforms, and a spoken desire to return to the kind of intellectually complicated, technically on-demanding play that Arcanum is rightfully famous for. Arcanum released in 2013 might be a big winner. Arcanum released in 2001 was not. But it did turn a profit enough to keep the company alive through one more traditional tabletop-inspired product, an electronic version of the classic D&D adventure, The Temple of Elemental Evil, which also turned a profit and led into Troika's third and final game, a game whose design values are almost the exact inverse of Arcanum's. Where Arcanum was the relative apex of a dying genre, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, as it's awkwardly named, was one of the pioneers of the contemporary first-person RPG. It stands today as one of the most impressive in relative complexity, but it's a deeply flawed game, not just for the technical problems that render it practically unplayable in parts, but in many core aspects of its design. It strives to be a truly great game, and in parts it is. In parts it is also absolutely terrible. The difficulty with Bloodlines is that it has so few moments of middle ground, where you're just having a good time. It's either extremely engaging in brief spurts, or infuriatingly tedious and broken, and your experience will violently seesaw from one extreme to the other continually throughout play. The whole aesthetic is, both in terms of the game world and the game's pacing and scope, about as different from Arcanum as you can get. I wondered often while playing Bloodlines if I wasn't seeing a deliberate move away from Arcanum's sensibilities, a hand extended to the publishers, saying, "Here, we can make this a lot more lively if you just give us considerably more money than last time." At first, perhaps, that seemed like a good bargain. Troika was now working with the publisher Activision, and Activision helped them acquire what must have seemed like a Christmas miracle to a small game developer struggling for recognition: early access to Valve's legendary engine, long before Half-Life 2 was even released. The business agreement actually insisted that Bloodlines could not be released before Half-Life 2, and both games ended up being released simultaneously on the same day of November in 2004. Bloodlines would sell around 72,000 copies. Half-Life 2 would sell millions. But being able to use such powerful technology was a major opportunity for Troika, especially the Source Engine's powerful ability to render facial expressions. This would allow Bloodlines to be fully voiced and lip-synced by characters in real time, and allow them to look good while doing it. Even playing the game in 2013, it's impressive what they accomplished with facial expressions and body languages in the game. In 2004, it was jaw-dropping. In fact, on its release 9 years ago, Bloodlines was tremendously progressive and wildly ahead of its time in many elements of its design. But it was also broken. And where Bloodlines can often be very, very smart, it can be in equal turns unbearably stupid. One fundamental difference between Arcanum and Bloodlines is that Arcanum was a totally original intellectual property which Troika had total creative control over, and Bloodlines is part of the extensive White Wolf tabletop gaming empire. Vampire the Masquerade is their vampire-specific line of products. Some of you may be familiar with an even earlier game called Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, totally unrelated to Bloodlines, but sharing the same creative universe, an enormous setting referred to as the World of Darkness. So, from a creative and developmental angle, a lot of groundwork was already done by adopting a pre-existing system, theoretically. In a 2006 article on Troika Games over on The Escapist, ex-Troika members talk about how they had to run pretty much all of their creative decisions past both Activision and the folks at White Wolf for approval, leading to an excruciating developmental hang-up. But the World of Darkness setting is pretty great. There's a reason it's been around for so long, and Troika did well in choosing it, if nothing else, for its uniqueness on the RPG market at the time. There were plenty of RPGs to choose from. Very few of them took place in the present day, especially not in big urban areas. Bloodlines would take place in an extremely condensed, slightly more gothic and depressing Los Angeles than the regular version, one populated by nuanced versions of all the classic movie monsters, and plenty of twisted original takes on the genre. It's important to note that this is all pre-Twilight, pre-True Blood, the show anyway, and when Bloodlines was released, both Buffy the Vampire Slayer and its spin-off Angel had been off the air for nearly a year. Not a lot of people were stoked on vampires in 2004, not like now, not nearly. So Bloodlines goes out of its way to be a gritty, modern, rootin', tootin', shootin' vampire epic filled with gore and tits and bullets, mixing up cable TV melodrama with classic RPG design. It strove to be original, and it certainly was, at least in its presentation and its blending of all sorts of pop cultural elements. Arcanum's world was a world of print, long discourses, and considered elocution. Bloodlines feeds from the blood of the almighty television with the same fierceness the player does the blood of the living. Dialogue is fast-paced, highly characterized, and framed with many more musical and visual cues than Arcanum, not just because of the engine, but because of its need and its desire to come across as modern and fresh. Bloodlines is written about Los Angeles in the spirit of Los Angeles. But it's also several dozen aging software developers brainstorming how to make a 3D computer role-playing game in 2004 come across as hip, edgy, and most disastrously sexy. They try very hard. They try too hard. The thing is, Bloodlines can be pretty obnoxiously juvenile. And before you think, what's this prude going on about, let me define my terms. I don't personally give any kind of a fuck about saying fuck. I don't think there's anything sinful about tits. I don't want everything to be sunshine and roses all the time. But Bloodlines overplays its hand on all of those elements constantly, as if to say, oh yeah, can you believe we just put that in the game? We be a bunch of crazy motherfuckers, am I right? Right, guys? No, but seriously, I would like to be validated about how cool that I'm being right now. Please. When I talked about Arcanum, I talked about how it was so memorable for how cleverly it blended its fundamental cliches. Bloodlines is, by contrast, continually mired in them. Not always. Major exceptions and real creative successes abound in the game, but in any given hour of play, there's going to be a handful of moments where you're going to roll your eyes, put your chin in your hand, and reconsider what you're doing with your evening. It's this inconsistency that's most maddening about Bloodlines. I didn't really enjoy playing it. My primary emotional state while playing was patient exasperation. But certain moments were handled with tremendous competency and imagination, and stay with me long after I forget what's forgettable. The major characters are where the game shines the brightest, the real power elite of Los Angeles, like Sebastian LaCroix, the subtly foppish vampire prince of Los Angeles, or Nines Rodriguez, the cartoonishly manly, tough but fair, all-American vampire and leader of the Anarch community, or the Anarch Baron of independent Hollywood. They're all pretty great in a lot of ways, and slightly stupid in a couple of others. None really manage to transcend the cliches at the root of their characters, but the voice actors all put in such a winningly charismatic performance that it's forgivable. The way the game lays out a complicated system of vampire politics for the player to navigate is its strongest narrative thread, although the ramifications of your choices ultimately go nowhere when you reach the game's shockingly weak ending. In any case, the fully voiced, uncommonly expressive characters you meet and the choices they present to you are varied and often quite nuanced. Besides certain key moments of dialogue, quest design is Troika's most impressive accomplishment in the game. The best early game example of this is the famous Ocean House quest, a journey into a haunted early 20th century hotel that has no combat elements, just exploration and well-timed, enduringly effective scares. It's one of the best virtual haunted houses ever put to screen, partly because it's one of the few instances of a game fully embracing the idea of ghosts as being a problem insoluble with guns. It's one of those areas of the game with the most polish, too. Later quests vary in quality a lot more widely. In the home of the Malkavian Primogen, for example, a variety of vampire prone to madness, you hear a fantastically narrated account of descent into blood and insanity, but you also find tedious level design with obtuse puzzles scattered throughout. You get to visit a twisted house of horrors high in the Hollywood Hills, followed by a mandatory sewer shoot-'em-up that lasts over an hour. You get to steal an ancient sarcophagus containing what might possibly be an ancient vampire who will rise up and consume the world. But you have to do it either by murdering several dozen security guards or use a broken and unforgiving stealth system to sneak by them, inching forward with an excruciating slowness. For every reason why I want to be playing Bloodlines at a given moment, I am confronted with an equally valid reason to shut it down and go do something better. But when it works, it works. Bloodlines has a tremendous cult following. What about the game makes it so enduringly popular, despite its flaws? It was one of the first 3D RPGs to really carefully consider alternate playstyles and multiple solutions. Deus Ex arguably broke the most ground on this sort of game design, but Bloodlines is extremely notable for being the first time that old-school tabletop-influenced RPG makers seriously attempted to go at it. There are so many solutions the game accommodates for your character that you feel truly unique in what you do in the game. Different character builds are given tremendous special attention, and certain types of vampires have very different game experiences. The Nosferatu, for example, can't ever pass for human, and must spend the entire game avoiding mortals. and the Malkavians get an entirely different set of player dialogue and some special game moments that reflect the mental illness their lineage is cursed with. The customization of playstyle is great. Unfortunately, the look of the player character is not. You grow accustomed in the modern era to being able to choose how your character looks in a game. Back then, you just took what they gave you. Being forced to look like an extra from the set of Knight of the Roxbury just because I wanted to play a Toreador is a minor complaint that builds over time, as you see the actions you've chosen be performed by a player model that looks ridiculous. Often, the player model's movements are extremely janky and odd during cutscenes as well, drifting diagonally across space to meet a character for dialogue or ending up stuck inside a piece of furniture for the duration. It's silly. It looks silly. And then the game throws around all of these adult themes like rape and expects you to still be able to take it seriously, which is problematic in a couple of respects. Let's talk about Jeanette and Therese, the poster girls for Bloodlines. Jeanette is a slutty vampire schoolgirl. Therese is a cold, all-business vampire bitch. But they're both Malkavian, and as it turns out, both the same person. And it's a split personality that stems from the young Jeanette Therese being repeatedly raped by their father's little girl, as explained in detail during one of Bloodline's early climactic moments. Now, I watch a lot of Law & Order. I'm not unfamiliar with the idea of letting rape be the catalyst for creative storytelling. It's possible to do it, but it requires a very delicate hand. You may have noticed that Bloodlines has not been very successful about handling issues delicately thus far. So, here's what we end up with. A slutty vampire and her bitch sister, and you gotta choose between them, or else talk them out of it if you got the persuasion points. And both of them have been presented to the player in exactly as shallow and heavy-handed a way as I've just described. Jeanette acts like a very stereotypical manipulative slut. Therese is a very stereotypical cold-hearted bitch who's dismissive of you. I cannot think of two more cliché female video game archetypes. I mean, they're it, the bitch and the slut. But wait, they're the same person! Doesn't this fascinating revelation redeem the cliché? No, it makes it worse. And furthermore, the way it melodramatically plays out with Jeanette's accusatory, surprisingly graphic descriptions of the rape and Therese's pious, prudish denials of it, it's way too heavy for a game as generally ridiculous as Bloodlines, and it's written as if stolen whole from Uncle John's bathroom reader of edgy dialogue. Then you've got that creepy, uncomfortable painting on the wall that foreshadowed this confrontation. This whole business is not progressive writing, it's bullshit. It's Psych 101 nonsense turned up to 11 for shock value, and the marketing value of having prominently featured a vampire schoolgirl in a miniskirt. Even Dick Wolf wouldn't have greenlighted something this dumb until maybe Season 9 of SVU. What's stranger is that the overwhelming majority of women characters in Bloodlines are presented similarly. You've got women characters motivated by sex, women characters motivated by money, and women characters using one or both of those things to pursue a shallow secondary goal. Playing a male character, I was constantly given the opportunity to flirt with or behave sexually with almost every last character with tits and a few without. The women characters are overall much shallower than the male ones. Few occupy a position of power besides Ming Zhao, leader of the Eastern Vampires, but even that won't stop the player from acquiring a topless poster of her for their vampire haven. I have never complained about gender representation in the game before. Bloodlines is bringing it out in me. I am a straight white male in my 20s. I should be the target demographic for this shit, but Bloodlines is a game that wants you to take it seriously, to be invested in the seeming realness of its gothic, nocturnal Los Angeles. When gamers complain about a lack of realism, there's almost an infinite list of minutiae they complain about, but I really rarely hear people complain that lazily written female characters, portrayed as money and power-hungry sex machines that resemble approximately no one I've ever met in the real world, contribute to a major loss of realism. But I'm sure as hell going to complain about it here. It's not like, I think, at some point in the game's development, one Troika employee leans into another and says, "You know, I've been thinking about it, and bitches ain't shit but hoes and tricks, and I think we should make the game inclusive of that perspective." It doesn't seem deliberate like that, but it does seem lazy, and it is incompetent. And most of all, it's weird coming from Troika, who presented a relatively egalitarian gender perspective with Arcanum, and that's a game where women don't even have the right to vote. It's half-assed. As much in Bloodlines feels half-assed, even something as fundamental as combat. Combat is pretty emblematic of the technical shortcomings of Bloodlines in general. It's unbalanced, heavily rewarding melee characters, and making it so that a firearms-based vampire, one that a lot of players are going to want to have in a modern first-person RPG, has to wait until over half the game is gone before having satisfactory combat options. And then they'll throw more enemies at you during the game's extremely boring and very difficult final sequence than you have bullets to manage. The combat is terrible, flat out, no two ways about it, terrible. But the game can be so engaging when the plot and the characters and play options are firing on all cylinders that it's manageable, a disappointment you can put behind you. Then, suddenly, any support for non-combat character builds is yanked away, and you have a climactic 2 hours of awkward violence to slog through, regardless of what you've spent the whole game preparing for. It's even stranger and more insulting, considering the level of detail put into things like custom TV news broadcasts that react to player choice. And that's the end of the game. In the first half, you're limited to just a few guns, all of which have deliberately awful and inaccurate mechanics to make it so you can't really shoot straight unless that's your character build, and even then, only if you have late-game weapons. If you can make it through all that bullshit, Bloodlines has one last disappointment for you. Its ultimate climax is an incredibly weak cop-out. At the top of LaCroix's skyscraper, you finally have the power to open the Arcanum sarcophagus and see if it means the end of the world or not. You don't really get that choice. Bloodlines, in true TV style, takes the player's choice away so they can let a very stupid bait-and-switch play out. You give LaCroix the key. Why? I don't know, you do. Then you dramatically exit. LaCroix opens the casket, and it's filled with explosives. Whoops! What a goof, right, fellas? The only major plot thread they've foreshadowed through the entire game was a red herring. What a laugh! Well, it's a laugh at the player's expense. If Bloodlines had preserved the viability of multiple paths up to the end, if it hadn't been so damn buggy, if it had some kind of epilogue, this might be forgivable. In light of the fact that the player has had to struggle against the incompetent construction of the game itself for nearly 30 hours to reach this point, only to have the game yell psych and descend into another deep cliché is nothing short of a slap in the goddamn face.
Sacrifice. Who are you?
That a beautiful thing. Hey, mess around, buddy. I'm talking to you. You don't really talk much, do you? Hey, it happened just like you said. They never even knew what hit them.
Remember, wherever we go, it is the blood of Cain which makes our fate.
I don't think Bloodlines was a good game. Ultimately, I feel like it's a terrible game with brilliant moments. I wasn't always of that opinion, though. When I first played the game in 2004 when I was in high school, I was pretty blown away by the novelty of it compared with other games at the time. And as years rolled by, I remembered the good parts, and whenever Bloodlines would come up in conversation, I was one of the people who would have said, "Oh, forgotten classic, best game you never played." I was incredibly excited to replay it for the video, and then I experienced the game as an adult and with an open mind, and I was let down by it over and over and over again, not just on the points of technical production that people rightfully bring up, but on the points that so many of its enduring fans praise it for brilliance, the complexity of its characters, the depth of its setting. I was ready to be embraced by the warm nostalgia of a true classic. What I found was a mess of good ideas bound together by a web of terrible ones. Troika staffers tend to blame Activision for rushing them to completion, but after my experience with Bloodlines, I'm partial to Activision. If, after 3 years of development, this is what the people I invested in had to show for it, I would have done the same thing. I would have pulled the plug, tell them they're done, pack it in, ship it out, go home, have done with it. Even their use of the is iffy. The version that Bloodlines uses is so early that Troika had to develop movement and AI code independently from Valve, and they didn't do a very impressive job of it. Having recently played a lot of Half-Life, it's strange to see a kind of failed Neanderthal offshoot of that classic engine. It's so different, you might not even recognize it as the same foundation. It's a missed opportunity, like so much of the game. Bloodlines could have been a true modern classic, but it would have taken it more than just additional time and money to save it. The influence of Bloodlines lingers, though. Its successes and failures in blending new and old-school game design are enduringly relevant and fascinating to look at as a snapshot of the struggles of the genre to reach where it is today. No doubt I'll hear from many people about how meaningful an experience Bloodlines was to them when they played it. That's as may be. I ask, have you played Bloodlines lately? In memory, it rests in a comfortable bed of nostalgia and cherry-picked moments. In actuality, it is not only a game that's technically flawed, as anyone will agree with, but also a game that's flawed in its creative design, with inconsistent writing and characters that are deeply cliché. It's a game that tries as hard as it can to be the edgiest thing you've played in a while. It's a game that falls flat on its face in that ambition. And lastly, it's the game that put Troika out of business. Ex-Troika employees are quick to point the finger at Activision, that they were too pushy with the deadline, that they refused to continue to fund Troika because Activision perceived them as too niche interest. Previously, like I said, I might have sided with Troika. But after spending a serious amount of time with both games, I've ultimately seen it from Activision's perspective. These are niche games. And while Troika is incredibly skilled with old-school design and tabletop-influenced world-building, as seen in Arcanum, their attempt at modernizing was anything but smooth. Troika's games are beautiful in ambition and wholly inelegant in execution. I love Arcanum, love it to pieces. It's a real swan song for the isometric RPG. Bloodlines was a pioneering title, but it's a bad game. And if that's the direction Troika was headed, maybe 3 games was enough. Regardless of how you feel about Vampire Bloodlines or about Arcanum, there's no denying that both of them are very historically important games. The story of Troika Games in general is a very fascinating one and relevant to sort of the state of gaming industry today. There's not a lot that we really hear about for sort of the malaise period of game design between about 2001 and 2006. There's a lot about the old school stuff, 99 and before. There's a lot about the new school stuff, 2008 and above. But this transitionary period for the gaming industry is really interesting, and these 2 games are some of the most interesting games from that period. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you. The true costs of progress. Should mysticism disappear, or does it serve a purpose? What does the distant past matter if almost everything you see was created within the past few hundred years? Arcanum is truly remarkable for how it blends the player's knowledge and assumptions about both modern civilization and the standard fantasy setting in ways that are consistently fascinating and delightful, and its willingness to be clever and playful with its cliches is a big part of its overall charm. A major commitment to a kind of intellectual plausibility and general realness is another part. Arcanum, more than any other role-playing game I've played, modern or otherwise, considers how economic and political factors interact with cultural values to create societies. Early in the game, you visit Durnholm, the capital of the Kingdom of Cumbria. You hear the story of its dragon knights, the chivalrous old guard who wielded magic weapons and beautiful ornate armor, and how they were gunned down to the last man by volunteers with rifles from the technologically progressive nation of Tarant to the north. A familiar story, but I don't think you can really fault Troika for wanting to throw in a little of the charge of the Light Brigade. It's a well-placed, apt historical reference, which Arcanum is full of. But that happened years ago, as far as Arcanum is concerned, and the Durnholm you see is a Durnholm that's had to live with the consequences of its increasing irrelevance in the modern world for decades. It's dirt poor, politically misguided, clinging to tradition as unemployment peaks. There's still a king and queen and castle of Cumbria. That's not what the people want. They want jobs. Now that's the kind of world building you almost never see, not just opportunistically letting the player witness the big moments of a place's history, but assuming that the player is interested in how these Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. In this video we're going to be looking at 2 old-school role-playing games, Arcanum and Vampire Bloodlines. Both games were released by Troika Games, a now-defunct developer founded by people who worked on the original Fallout. Now, both Arcanum and Bloodlines have incredible cult followings, but outside of that, they're pretty much forgotten titles. Why didn't they sell very well to begin with? Why, if people continually praise them for their creativity and ingenuity, is there not a more stronger, lasting impression of them? We're going to be taking a look, starting with Arcanum. Arcanum began as a tremendous ambition by 3 titans of early computer role-playing design. Tim Cain, Leonard Boyarsky, and Jason Anderson, the 3 men principally behind the original Fallout. Following Fallout's release, they felt like Interplay's executive branch was making questionable decisions with the company, and struck out on their own to create a traditional 2D isometric role-playing game the way they always wanted, with total creative control. After doing preliminary work between just the three of them, now-defunct publisher Sierra Entertainment began working with them and funded the project, expanding the team to 12. But while the ambition and creativity driving Arcanum is undeniable, there's only so much that a 12-man team with a limited budget can accomplish. Arcanum, as played today in 2013, is a fascinating piece of video game history for that essential conflict. It's arguably one of the last great 2D isometrics, but it was dated and broken even on its release in 2001. What Arcanum is as a creative accomplishment and what Arcanum is as an entertainment product are wildly different creatures, factors that made it a pretty minimal success when it came out, selling around 235,000 copies, but make it an enduringly remarkable example of the special challenges video games as a creative medium face. Arcanum, as Troika's first game, was a culmination of all its founders' practical knowledge of traditional design. For many of those design features, this would be their last gasp, a final stand for old-school role-playing that lays plain the strengths and weaknesses of a mostly forgotten style of gaming. So what is Arcanum? Well, it's a beautiful variation on traditional fantasy. It takes the standard fantasy setting, elves, orcs, dwarves, castles, kingdoms, swords, sorcery, and then lets humans have their industrial revolution. With the steam engine, humans have conquered much of the world, and the ways of magic, which are fundamentally incompatible with technology, are disappearing from the world. The Age of Legends, which people in Arcanum call the time of the world's history that would have resembled other more cliché fantasy settings, is long gone. Mages live in ghettos, shut out by technological economy. Orcs labor in Dickensian factories as second-class citizens. Elves and dwarves have withdrawn into their ancient forests and mines, now threatened by logging, poaching, coal speculation, and other human interests. Meanwhile, conflicts and events set in motion thousands of years ago in the time of legends are just now reaching their conclusion, and the world neither remembers nor cares. But it should, because shit is about to get quite serious. It's 1888, and you are the only surviving passenger of a horrific blimp crash. The blimp having been shot down by two heavier-than-air flying craft, an obvious impossibility. A gnome, dying from injuries sustained in the crash, gives you a ring and a request. Find the boy. That's all the information you begin with, and what follows is an incredibly lengthy odyssey to discover the truth behind the attack, the gnome, and the ring. Along the way, you'll do what old-school RPG design is rightfully best known for, deciding the outcome of an impossibly huge variety of personal, social, political, and moral conflicts across an exuberantly creative world. The creativity of the world is Arcanum's greatest strength, undeniably. It's one of the most deeply steampunk games ever released, investing considerably more effort and thought into the aesthetic than most modern games, Bioshock Infinite included. The questions the world of Arcanum faces, by moving traditional fantasy all the way to 1888, end up mirroring many questions that the player has to grapple with in the real world. What are the two key moments would truly play out in the long run, and that the player would want a complex answer to those complex questions? Like Fallout, Arcanum has ending slides, giving epilogues to many of the regions you pass through and alter on your path to the truth. But they're considerably more complicated slides than Fallout's. Many town outcomes consider 3 to 5 different factors in deciding your epilogue slide, including how you dealt with separate issues in other regions. It's a perfect way to cap off Arcanum, since through the bulk of the game you'll be continually interacting with Arcanum in these major, ethically murky affairs of state. One day, for example, while in Toronto, a newspaper headline talks about an orcs workers' strike at a factory led by a fellow named Don Throg. Now, if you ignore it, the police will storm the picket line and kill all the striking workers, including Throg. But if you involve yourself, you might not only save Throg, but encourage him to pursue more conventional political power. At the time, it seems like a pretty fun, quick side quest. But it turns out in the epilogue that Don Throg alters Tehran's entire political destiny, depending on whether he lives or dies, affecting not only most of Tehran's ending slides, but some of the neighboring kingdom of Caledon's as well. In contemporary RPGs, in attempting to appeal to a very broad player base, games tend to give very strong, obvious clues to how your decisions will play out, and for a very understandable reason. To a lot of players, it's frustrating for the game to produce results counter to how they anticipated it being. If you've only got a limited amount of time or patience for games, you might only play through them once, and if you look at achievement statistics for Steam or for Xbox Live, you'll find that most people don't